Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the Andersen Group for an informative 45 minutes on the topic, Building Your Brand Through Targeted Social Media. My name is Roger Shine, and I'll be your moderator today. This also marks the first in our series of webinars on different subjects that we hope will be valuable to both you and your business. By way of a quick introduction, for those of you who don't know us, the Andersen Group aims to help business leaders, such as yourselves, apply new and actionable branding concepts to energize, strengthen, and profitably grow your organizations. In other words, the new rules in business require companies to think differently in order to defy convention and deliver new ideas. And we want to be part of your team in order to do that. As I mentioned, and as you know, today's subject is on social media. It's a topic where there's already tons of information out there, and yet questions do persist on the best approach to take in order to receive successful results. That's where today's presentation comes in, and as you know, the topics include knowing your customer, which also includes how to move from persuading and promoting to connecting and creating. We'll also talk about communicating using the right channels and how to be strategically active in social media. And our last section will be about allocating your social dollars with purpose. And also, we'll share some ideas on ways to plan, execute, and measure your efforts more effectively. Speaking on today's subject are two of my colleagues here at the Andersen Group, Jennifer Brew and Robert Holmes. They work together here every day, not only to tell their clients' stories, but to make sure that those stories connect with their clients' customers. And just a few things before I turn the presentation over to Jen and Robert. First, we've planned time at the end of this presentation to address any questions you might have along the way. So feel free to send us any questions then or anytime during the presentation using GoToWebinar. And there's a menu of options that you'll see on your screen. We're also recording the webinar, and we're going to be sending you a link via email to access the recording and the slides from this webinar. So don't feel you have to take notes. You'll get a copy of everything in this presentation. Additionally, if you have any technical challenges and you need to call us, just call our main number, 610-678-1506, and ask to speak to Don Humanic. He'll take care of you. And lastly, if you're on Twitter, look for some key points to be posted using hashtag #TagSocial. Please tweet frequently if you can using that hashtag, and you'll see the hashtag #TagSocial on the right side of your screen at the bottom. It's on every slide. And now I'm excited to turn this over to Jen, who will start things off with the first of 3 simple polls that we have in the presentation. Jen?
Thanks, Roger. Welcome, everyone. It's good to be with you this afternoon. And before we jump into the formal part of the presentation, let's take a look at our first poll. And the question you're seeing right now is your biggest concern around social media. Just pick one of those answers. No wrong answers here. So maybe things are changing too rapidly. You're not sure how to measure effectiveness or what channels to choose, or you're trying to figure out how much time to devote to all of this. We'll wrap things up in a couple seconds. Final answers in. And the results look like a mixed bag, which is not surprising because all of the concerns that we just addressed are concerns that are universally voiced by CMOs across the country. So we see kind of an equal mix of looking at things changing too rapidly, at measurement, at channel choice, and at the amount of time that we need to devote. And the good thing about this presentation is we're going to touch, I think, on all of those areas. So as you have questions about those, we hope we can address those throughout. So let's jump first into what social media is. It's an interesting question that requires a lot of definitions from a lot of different people online. You'll see some who will say it's the future of communication. You'll find others who will say that it's all about the way you change your business. You'll find others who will say it's web-based or mobile-based. Some will just call it a community. Some will say it's about interactions. Some will get very broad and say it's about awareness, which is kind of the default answer for everything in marketing these days. It's obvious that there's questions that persist on why social media is valuable. So we give a definition in its simplest form. Social media is defined as websites and applications used for social networking. From our perspective, from the Anderson Group's perspective, then social media allows you to create the right connection and the right solution for the right customer, all by choosing channels and tools to enable the strongest possible real-world impact. When it comes down to the basics, it's still about making the right choices given all of the options, and there's a ton of options out there. Yes, social media has had an impact on all of us, but it begins with a solid brand and strategy. So that's why you're looking at Abraham Lincoln right now, whose wise words mirror the importance of being strategic and not just jumping into social media without a plan of attack. As Abe said, give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I will spend the first 4 sharpening the axe. Robert?
Jen, as you mentioned, here at the Anderson Group, we really believe that communicating is about creating the most valuable and authentic relationship between your brand and your customers. And the solution for that will be very unique to each brand. The channels and avenues where those solutions are likely to play out are increasingly within the social, digital, mobile, and technical intersections of our lives. And therefore, all of that makes social media an incredibly critical channel. But that said, really isn't about being good at social media. We have to retain the idea that the real goal is to be good at business because of social media. As you can see from looking at this chart, we want to retain and hold on to the clarity that this kind of process will give us in making decisions, starting with the brand, following with your marketing objectives, what kind of content strategy best serves those objectives, and then how does that tell you what you should create, curate, distribute, or manage as a part of your social media. All of this is very applicable when it comes to using social as a channel. Another way to think about this is to look at how other brands are doing it. Some of the larger and more compelling brands have great clarity and great mission built around their stories. Because of that, they're also very successful within social media by using that clarity. Think about Starbucks. Their mission is to inspire and nurture the human spirit, one person, one cup, one neighborhood at a time. And you see that expressed in their dedication to community and servicing that within the social environment. Nike is very interesting. They want to bring inspiration and innovation to athletes all over the world, both amateur and pro. How does that translate for them? It comes down to creating share-worthy and digestible content with a lot of visual, a lot of videos in ways that people can easily pass and use as a part of their community. Warby Parker is an interesting story. You've got a firm that came out of nowhere with a very clear mission to change the way that we buy eyeglasses. They also wanted to do good while achieving that. For every pair sold, they're giving 1 pair away to someone in need. So far, they've given away over 500,000 pairs. And they're using the social platform in a very strategic way to do this. They're disrupting their existing industry. They've created new channels. They've transformed an expected buying experience for that kind of product. And they're doing it all through a very integrated strategy, employing Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. Jen?
Which leads us to our first discussion point for today. which is all about knowing your customer, or as I'll challenge you to think about it in a kind of a different way, ask yourself, do you know your customers as well as they know you? Looking at Alfred Hitchcock for a minute, he knew his audience very well. I remember where I was when I saw Psycho for the first time and how it made me feel. We might not advise you to follow the same path as Alfred Hitchcock, who said always make the audience suffer as much as possible, but he knew and understood that that's what his audience craved from him and from his brand. When it comes to knowing your customer then, the first point we're going to talk about is acknowledging the value of developing long-term relationships over views, impressions, or fans. Two examples on the screen right now. Keep in mind which one you think is fleeting, meaning that it's all about views, impressions, or fans, or enduring, meaning that it's about long-term relationships. It may seem kind of obvious at first, but maybe not so much. First up is Miley Ray Cyrus. Everybody understands and remembers what she did in August at the MTV Video Music Awards, where she created a whirlwind of activity on social media. On Twitter, she had over 300,000 tweets per minute during her performance, as you can see from the tweet that she sent out the next morning. It's a huge, impressive sounding number. The biggest number of the year. It was bigger than the numbers from the Super Bowl when we had the blackout. But you have to ask yourself, is this just a fleeting moment in time, or is it enduring? And in the days after the VMAs, a lot of people who judged her performance not just by what was happening on Twitter, but what they had seen and what the general population's reaction was, would have said that it was fleeting. But what we've seen in the last month or so is that her new management is now trying to rebrand this little Disney star. And her music is being very critically reviewed in a positive way. She's getting a lot of good grades. So the question, will she be relevant next year? We'll have to wait and see. An example of an enduring brand, on the other hand, and one that is shining in social right now, has been around for over 100 years. And if you're a farmer, by any chance, you probably have saved your copies of the Furrow magazine, which you see the cover of on the screen. It's John Deere's publication. They learned the basics of content marketing over 100 years ago by knowing they needed to provide content to their customers that's educational and useful, and not overtly or always about John Deere. The Furrow values long-term relationships. The jury's out right now on what Miley Ray Cyrus values. The second thing you need to think about when it comes to customers is moving from persuading and promoting to connecting and co-creating. Many argue that we are always about selling. We are always promoting, especially in the business that we're all in. And that's true. But there is a key distinction between the two sides that you see on the slide right now. It can't always be just about you. And that's where you kind of land when you think about persuading and promoting all the time. Think about the brands that you follow personally on social media. I can throw out a couple examples of my own. First, I think of Canon and cameras. I follow them on Twitter because they were so good with my dad in customer service when he needed replacement parts for a camera that he's had for over 30 years. He still talks about that story, much to my mother's dismay. It comes up nearly every other week when I see him. I follow Old Spice on Facebook because the way they word things is quirky and amusing, and I just like the way that sounds. I follow Traditional Home on Pinterest because they do the best home and decor trend boards around. I don't follow any of these brands, or any of the others for that matter, because they give me discounts or new product news all day long. I care about those brands because I feel like they care about me in response. Example on the screen right now is 42 Quilts. This is an author and quilt maker who's found her niche using Facebook as her platform. There's nothing overly covert about what she's doing. She's just getting people talking, and specifically about quilting. She encourages them to be part of her conversation, and if you're into quilting, it's likely she has something to say that you're going to find appealing. Her posts don't just get the obligatory likes. They get tons of comments, and those comments feed other comments and people who get into the conversation. And ultimately, if she sells a few books on Amazon, which is probably what she's trying to do in the first place, That's all good for her. To this point, under the category of knowing your customer, we've talked about striving for long-term relationships specifically that where you're encouraging others to connect and co-create right along with you. The third and last point of this section states the obvious. Millennials are not boomers. For those of you who are listening who were born between 1946 and 1964, and I'm sitting in the room with a pair of them right now, otherwise known as boomers, you kind of know you've owned the world for the past decade or so. You have the numbers and the buying power to back up that claim. It's very easy to dismiss me being part of Generation X. We're small, we are skeptical, we're often referred to as broke, and for a while, the babies who were behind us, known as millennials, were just the annoying tweens who were interesting, but they didn't have any money just yet, maybe just their parents' money. But now millennials who were born in the 80s and 90s are finding their way in the world after college. And with that, what we're seeing is boomer stability is giving way to millennial growth. While their numbers are relatively the same, at about 80 million, their priorities are different. The way to reach them is different. And if you think just jumping into social media will guarantee their eyes to you, we're unfortunately all as a collective group sadly mistaken. I'll throw out a statistic to you that I just saw recently that was given by Google. They conducted a survey where they found, and this is kind of, take it with a grain of salt, 33% of millennials would rather be the victim of identity theft than to reveal any of their Facebook history to you or me. Now, granted, I'm sure there isn't a person out there who would like to be an identity theft victim, but think about the fact that they're saying, I'd rather you take away my identity than tell you anything about what I do on Facebook. So what does that mean for you in social media, which just happens to be the primary way that they communicate? Number one, as we said, boomer stability is giving way to millennial growth. That results in more transactional relationships with brands. That leads to a weakened emotional connection with brands. And the reason behind all of this is the many, many resources that's available to them to find out all kinds of helpful information beyond what they would just find from brands like you or me. The way to combat this commodity-like atmosphere then in social media, and particularly with millennials, is one-to-one marketing. They want to be treated like a person rather than a transaction or a data point. And a last quick point on this slide is the example that you see, which is from Red Bull. Red Bull targeted Nittanyville, or known as Paternoville, or Tent City in Penn State, prior to the Michigan game a couple weekends ago. They left cases of Red Bull outside the tents for students to find and share with a love note that read, as you see, "Nobody ever wishes they slept more in college." And their hope was, and they saw it fulfilled here, is that people would tweet that and share that and take photos of it and share it on Instagram and share it on Twitter, and you see that kind of in reality here with that image. It was a nice touch from Red Bull. Let's pause for a minute and take a pulse with a second poll. Which channel are you most comfortable using for business? Think about this from a business perspective, and take a few minutes or a few seconds to take a look and make your choice. I think you can just pick one, so keep it just narrow to one choice. Take a last couple seconds, and I think we will close the poll, get our results. Oh wow, we find a pretty resounding Facebook answer. There's a couple Google Plus, and we'll get to why that's a channel to keep in mind a little bit later in the presentation. But when it comes to Facebook, it's no surprise it remains the largest group, the largest social media network out there when it comes to the number of users. Currently, Facebook is quoting that they have 1.19, I think is the latest number, billion users and active users per month. So let's take that and keep that in mind as we get into the second section of our presentation, which is on communicating using the right channels. Let's think about this date in history, November 6th. It's momentous not only for the fact that you're sitting with us during this webinar, but also back in 1528, we had a gentleman with a name that's a bit of a mouthful. Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca became the first European to set foot in Texas. Think about that in relationship to communicating using the right channels. Probably people heard about this through word of mouth. It might have been by someone who was riding a horse. It could have been by boat. It could be today, if this is the first time you've ever heard of this lovely gentleman and his achievements. But it's a way of communicating that type of news. If we fast forward to 1934, I'd ask if there were any Eagles fans listening in. They had a pretty amazing weekend. At least they won, so that was a good thing. But in 1934, they won really big by beating the Cincinnati Reds 64-0. That was probably splashed across the front pages of local newspapers of the day. It might have been a feature on the radio, but otherwise, it wasn't like there was an ESPN back in 1934 who would replay the highlights over and over and over again. Let's fast forward to 2011, when over 45,000 runners participated in the New York City Marathon. This was one of the first instances for the marathon that video and social media and GPS technology was integrated. If you downloaded an app, you could watch your favorite runner live and track their progress throughout the race. Think about how different 2011 was from what happened just this past weekend, when social media, again, yes, was about tracking runners, but it was also very much focused on security and talking still and reminiscing still about the aftermath of what we saw happen earlier this year in Boston. Some would argue that 1528 was a simpler time when it came at least to selecting the right channel to tell your news. The right channel was probably the only channel available to you. Today we're left to determine, though, which channels are the right channels to use when you want to communicate. And if you make the wrong decision, it could make all the difference in the world. And we can think about last Friday as a kind of a perfect example of an organization that did something right. If you looked at LAX's, the airport LAX, their Twitter feed early in the day on Friday morning, you would have seen a tweet of a group of employees dressed in Halloween costumes. If you were part of the panicked crowd who wanted to get more information from LAX about what was happening during the aftermath of the airport shooting that happened, and you turned to Twitter and they weren't updating that feed, that tweet would be the one that you would see. You'd probably get a lot of snarky responses from people online who were looking for information. Would have been kind of a crisis communications challenge in the making. Instead, LAX understood that that was a primary channel for them to use, and what they did is tweet out over 100 tweets in a 12-hour period of time throughout the day, giving valuable information to people who were in need. That being said, we're kind of excited that it's 2013 and not 1528. Because as you see in the quote on the screen, content is fire and social media is gasoline. If you use the right channels, it'll enable you to engage, share, contribute, be loyal, and find advocacy within your customer base. Looking at the first point under communicating using the right channels, take a look at the screen and you'll see that we talk about driving real-world impact through digital means, while at the same time balancing the capabilities that technology offers us with the quality of life we live offline. And the image you're seeing right now is a rhinoceros in what looks perhaps like a little model airplane, and in reality is actually a drone. If I had my PR hat on, I would say that talking about drones has a little bit of a bad connotation right now, given the news on drones. But manufacturers of them have come out of the woodwork, really, to determine ways to find new customer bases. This is an example of real-world impact. The World Wildlife Fund is testing simple versions of drone capabilities in Nepal and Namibia in specific, using a grant from Google. They do it to get ahead of poachers. Conservationists are saying that black market prices for rhinoceros horn have reached record highs, so they're looking for solutions to address poachers so that they can take care of that need. They're doing it through drones. And if you take drones just as they are. They're kind of dumb. So what the World Wildlife Fund has done is use records of wildlife movements and poaching to write a computer program that educates drones. In this case, it's modern technology for a modern conflict.
When it comes to effectively communicating using the right channels, it's very important to think about being strategically active. This means that it's really better to do the right one thing than a shotgun approach full of untargeted, non-strategic activity. The handful of well-known channels that you see here, they all have their different strengths. Facebook obviously is about building relationships and connections, and when it comes to social media, still the big elephant in the room. Huge sheer numbers of users spanning many, many different demographics. But there is a slowdown there when it comes to younger users who are fleeing their parents and increasing growth of their parents and older markets using it. Pinterest and Instagram are the established duo when it comes to visual social media. Pinterest just recently again was confirmed in driving more traffic to websites than all the other venues and social channels combined currently. It's a very, very active and valuable space to be used in the right ways by brands. I think of Tumblr as a lazy man version of a blog. You know, if I want to see a collection of GIFs of cute animals, or I want to see a graphical treatment of U.S. presidents, if I wanted to see the history of Coca-Cola marketing, this is a great venue for that. The common denominator here is that we're talking about visual, easy to digest, easy to share content. And this kind of micro-blogging platform really has not been broadly utilized by many brands. But some of the big players are starting to be active here. We're talking about brands like IBM, Keds, Life Magazine, Sesame Street, and Whole Foods. All are starting to strategically utilize this kind of content. When you think about YouTube, you're looking at an environment where 100 hours of video are uploaded every minute. The primary reasons people are visiting: entertainment, education, demonstration. All of these are great vehicles for brands. LinkedIn is not only about our own personal networking, but it goes much, much farther than beyond posting our resumes. For businesses, it's really about leveraging connections and showcasing skills, even potentially recruiting. Jen mentioned Google Plus earlier during one of the polls. This is a very key area, rapidly changing in terms of its value and its role. This is a core element in Google's entire online strategy. Having a presence on Google Plus has a direct relevance to your relationship with Google search, and that will increase. They launched Google Plus not only to compete with Facebook and Twitter, but to improve the quality and the nature of search engine results and make them much more contextual. And selfishly for Google, it just happens also to capture a lot of rich data on you and me. WordPress and Twitter are places that often are used to extol thoughts on leadership and expertise, both in long and short form, and are still very valuable. Now, getting back to the early point here, be strategically active. Let's talk about what for us is a regional example. Look at the Reading Eagle newspaper and what they're doing on Facebook. Now, Facebook, as we've mentioned, is all about building relationships and making connections. And the Reading Eagle really understands this. They understand the value specifically in doing this for younger users. They're heading toward 15,000 likes with an audience that shares, likes, and comments on pretty much everything that they post.
And to build off what Robert just said, remember when it comes to social networking, all age groups are well represented. Just look how far we've come since 2005, when there was no more than 10% of any age group actively engaged in social networking. Fast forward 8 years, and these percentages have grown at a pretty amazing rate. A couple things just to take away from this particular slide is that those under the age of 29, obviously the most savvy social media users out there. It's a way of life for them. It's what they know. It's how they communicate. It's what shapes their buying decisions. It's the way that they reach out to brands like you. And while the youngest group are nearly tapped out when it comes to additional users, in the high 80% on that chart, the group where you can see some growth and growth potential is actually in the age group over 50, who are in that 40 to 45% range. The last part of communicating using the right channels is to accelerate your mobile strategy. Think about the 80s when mobile phones were all about accessibility. It was a status symbol for people, and you carried around this 10-pound weight, but you could still talk on the go, which was pretty cool. That transition to smartphones and the power of mobility. A lot of you are probably holding your mobile phones, and I'm not going to take offense to it, because those little devices hold a lot of power, and it's hard to let them go. If you think about how many people across the world have smartphones, percentages suggest it's about 60% at this point. The next big thing, you all have heard about it, I'm sure, we're referring to it as experience. A couple weeks ago, and it still continues, I unfortunately continue to flick my laptop, hoping to advance to the next page like it was a tablet. And it's driving me crazy because it just does not work that way. Another example that you see right now is wearable technology. Whether it's Google Glasses or bracelets that will allow you to digitally touch someone that's halfway across the world, the power of touch, of experience, of apps, all driving mobile to the next place. To this point, then, we've talked about knowing your customer and choosing the right channel. The last major factor in all of this, really, is figuring out how to allocate your social media dollars with purpose. I'll turn things over to Robert to talk through that.
Before we do, let's do our third and final poll. I want to get your feedback about what is your #1 purpose for investing in social media. Think about it, select an option, and we'll close the poll here in just a few seconds. Looks like we still got some folks contributing. Okay, let's see what we've got. Interesting. This is very similar to our first poll, where we've got a blended mix, enhancing awareness, generating leads, building community, protecting brand and reputation. All of these things appear to be important to you, and that makes perfect sense. So let's talk about, in that kind of mix, how can you really define an actionable purpose to help guide your activities? When you're talking about allocating with purpose, I want to encourage you to take that question back to your more global business goals. It's very easy, because of the vibrancy and the speed and the energy in social media, to think about things only within that vortex or within that vacuum. But you need to think about what kind of true business goal is driving your activity. This is an interesting look at, for 2013, some of the numbers that represent the reasons that other firms, and probably some of your competitors, are investing in social. This changes from time to time as the space grows and the budgets and the focus on social are consistently growing. But as we saw in our poll, all of these are valid priorities and things that you'll want to consider when talking about a purpose. So once you've got an idea of a specific business purpose and goal that you want to operate on, really, how do you move through the process? As Jen mentioned, talking about Abe Lincoln, we can't stress enough the value of planning. Ask yourself, why are you using social? Who's going to be responsible for that media effort and accountable for its success? What kind of business impact do you want to achieve? And then what's the definition of success, both within the social activity and on the business? As we saw in our poll, there are some very great and valuable things that can be achieved through social. These can include enhancing awareness, protecting, transforming, or evolving your reputation, doing what might have been traditional public relations in the past, building community, enhancing or evolving your customer service approach, facilitating research and development, and gathering that intelligence to help guide your strategic planning for your business. And then one of the more obvious, driving leads and sales, very important to all of us. Once you've got this kind of clarity, how can we execute well? Make sure you don't forget to go back to that chart of your brand, your content strategy, your marketing objective, and then choices in what kind of content and what channels based on that. Make sure you're building both awareness and participation. It's not a one-way vehicle. And then build on momentum by planning for what could happen next or what will happen next. One of the more interesting and challenging parts of social media, and we saw it reflected in the first poll, is how do I measure my activity and how do I know if I'm doing what's right? There are some key things we would suggest here. One is simplifying measurement, again, by focusing on real-world business impact. Things like revenue growth, cost reductions, improved satisfaction. These are all the dials that we all want to move in our businesses, and they relate directly to social media activity. When you are making a comparison and analyzing, make sure you're using both cost-based analysis and ROI. If you use only one of these, you're not getting the complete picture. You want to try, if possible, to track the value of things like advertising, content creation value, research value, support and lead and sales value. And what I mean is, if you achieve some of these things in social, how does that compare to what it would cost you to achieve the same result through another kind of media, possibly more traditional? And then once you've identified that something is working, optimize and focus and go in that direction. And that should be an ongoing process. So we want to review some of the key takeaways and things that we've touched on today very quickly. Know your customers. Value long-term relationships over views. Move from persuading and promoting and the things we traditionally do as marketers, and think more about connecting and creating with your customer. Acknowledge that millennials aren't boomers and that you should likely have a specific strategy for each of those.
Under communicate using the right channels. First up, drive real-world impact through digital means. Remember that example with the rhino and the drones. Number 5 on this list, be strategically active. I know Facebook was the runaway winner when we took the second poll, but I would challenge you to think about some of the other places that we talked about throughout this presentation. And number 6, accelerate your mobile strategy.
So as we've talked about, make sure that you're allocating your social media budget with specific purpose. Know what business impact you want to create, understand why you're playing in social media, build a meaningful and relevant network for that kind of goal, and then track and optimize to what's working.
Before we get into your questions, I wanted to thank everybody on behalf of Robert and myself. This is what we do pretty much a good portion of the day. It's not just generally sitting here and giving presentations, but thinking about and then implementing strategies that are meant to meet a goal. And we're always interested in furthering the conversation. So if something struck you in particular during this webinar and you think about it later on today or next week, please feel free to reach out to either of us with any questions. But if there are immediate questions now, we can take a few minutes to answer them.
Yeah, we do have 2 questions that came through, so in the interest of time, we'll take them now. The first one is, which specific tool do you recommend for measuring social media efforts? Robert, you want to?
Yeah, you know, the good news is there is now a plethora of great tools that are surfacing, and this space is evolving very quickly. Some that I would point you to, Blitz Metrics is a great tool in terms of aggregating and really figuring out what's going on in multiple spaces. There's a tool called Karma, C-A-R-M-A, another great tool to really get a sense of how your brand recognition and your penetration is taking place. There are some great sharing tools out there, and I would point you to something like Hootsuite. If you're not familiar with that tool, that can greatly simplify your process in social media. And then there's some great innate analytics within some of the environments, and I would have you look at Pinterest and their analytics. Wonderful, detailed, very relevant analytics about what's happening within their space and how it's best serving and how you can optimize that. Another option would be something called SWIX, SWIX Analytics. A great tool, again, tracks 75 social media metrics in one dashboard, very valuable. And lastly, one to check out as well called Vocus, V-O-C-U-S, another great analytics platform.
All right, thanks, Robert. There's one other question. I'm not sure we have time to answer it today, but it's a very interesting question, so I'll ask it anyway. Someone wants to know, what percentage of my marketing budget should I allocate to social media? Could probably do a whole webinar on that. Jen?
It's a good question to ask, and I would, by way of time and by way of a short answer, and we can respond after the webinar in a little bit more detail to this particular question and the person who asked it. But I would suggest thinking back to what we talked about in the beginning, which is looking at business objectives that you have and letting that drive what's going to make up your marketing plan going forward. It's kind of a non-answer to say that there isn't a specific number or a specific percentage of dollars that you want to allocate towards social media, but there really isn't. It's really based on determining what your purpose is for using social media to begin with.
If I can just add real quickly to that, there is some great indications that the line is blurring between that amount of your budget and what you're doing in content relevant to global search, and that number in combination with social is expected to double for most budgets between 2013 and 2016. Wow. So keep that in mind.
Great. Well, in the interest of time, I want to thank our speakers for their sharing their knowledge, their experience, their viewpoints. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Robert. And thanks to all of you who called in and participated. We're glad you could join us. We hope that this session was helpful to you, and please feel free to share it with anyone who wasn't able to attend from your company or organization. Again, thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.